other hallucinations, patients won't be aware of it that they are hallucinating. So this is how the difference between predictable hallucinosis and the psychogenic hallucinosis. So this is one of the stroke manifestation, and hardly around 5 to 7 cases are reported on worldwide. It was first discovered by Hertmeier in around 19th century. So in this type of hallucinations mostly happen during the evening time. There is more during the night time, and patient will be having a vivid, clear images of the person and the objects he is aware of. So this is how the hallucination type will be described. So the treatment, now they have given us antipsychotic drugs like olanzapine was found more effective because they thought that this could be due to serotonergic activity. And now still it is in progress. So we will take further cases.
So Dr. Vinodna has presented a conceptual model of a disease here, and the disease is the hallucination. Now, how is this hallucination different from psychogenic hallucination? Is that the patient definitely has some insight into this hallucination, that he is actually hallucinating. The psychogenic person may not feel that he is hallucinating. We think that is reality for him. So here the patient has insight, and that probably differentiates it as an organic brain syndrome, where the patient is having developed some abnormality that he can catch in the brain. Now, everything in psychiatry is actually organic brain, because it's just that we cannot see those pathways. We label them as psychiatric. But there is something happening at organic level even there. It's just that it's not picked up in MRI. But this thing, which was picked up in the MRI in 18th century, there was no MRI at that time, but what was there? It would cut open the body and figure out the brain inside. And there they found that in the cerebral peduncles, which you I'm sure are aware is in the midbrain, in the crus cerebri. Yeah, pons is like this. And then you have crus cerebri coming out. And below the pons is the medulla, and you have those, prominent projections there of your organs and all that. So I think the peduncles are above the pons. There is a crus between them. That's what I am just having a conceptual model of. But we have to again verify it. Each one of us are carrying some conceptual models in our mind, which we have taken over the years, so we spoke to added data, and it's there in our brain. So sometimes we take this opportunity as a meeting to match our models. So in our models, the cerebral peduncles are in the pons. And in my model, it is
the name is particular hallucinosis, but the lesion was in pons.
Oh, yes. So the lesion is there in the pons. So what kind of a lesion is that? Pathology. So Dr. Vinodna has described very beautifully the clinical features and the way it was found out, the way it found the space in our conceptual model. So in fact, some of us are not even aware of it till now. But the way it had found to be a very nice picture. But what was the pathology? When we know that there is something which is visible in the pons, but what exactly happened there? And why did it happen? What was the etiology of that pathology? So in all probability, it was basically hemorrhagic lesion in the cerebral neurons there, or it was an ischemic lesion, which is called an infarctual changes. So that is what pathology was supposed. And because of that pathology and correlation between that pathology and the symptoms of the patient, we had this new entity called peduncular hallucination, which is because of a contamination. And this is what we have gained from Dr. Vinodna today. In terms of susceptibility, probably the psychiatrist will be able to manage it better. Like any hallucination, it's a very generic antipsychotic drug that is used in all kinds of psychosis, because it's a broader spectrum antipsychotic, it's a different antipsychotic. So if you are looking at the review that probably because the rare disease is only randomized controlled trial here, so probably it's just symptomatic treatment. So this is all we know about this particular condition which we have elaborated on. It seems to be a very rare thing, and I'm not sure whether you will see a patient, but yes, it will definitely help you when you do come across it. And if you keep on adding to your conceptual models, you build up this network where you can capture this newer information which comes in. If you don't have any net in your brain, you are not going to capture newer information. So each and every time that is spent in learning, discussing, and creating those models is done better. So now from this, I think we can move to Dr. Deepak. Now it will just go linear. Yeah, you can take some. So shall we pause it and shall we finish the PPE business? Evidence. Whether they were there or not, whether they spent the time properly or not, everything is taught on evidence. Aditya, is it okay?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Aditya?
I would like to discuss a simple topic which you most frequently encounter in your work or in your work in EMC, like simple topic like hypoglycemia. It is very important because it is very important to recognize hypoglycemia and as well as treat it immediately. And the immediate treatment of hypoglycemia is very useful for the patient benefit. So what is the most common cause of hypoglycemia that we come across? The most common cause of hypoglycemia that we come across is iatrogenic or drug induced. That is the patient taking a high dose of the oral hypoglycemic agents, which are mainly insulin secretagogues like sulfonylurea, and or higher dose of insulin. Or the patient not improperly taking insulin, like he's not taking insulin, where if you take an insulin, you should follow it up with a meal. So he's not taking, he's skipping his meals, or he's in between he's exercising a lot. So he's consuming a lot of energy, and he's not. And in between also when there's exercising a lot, and there is increased energy demand, and when he takes excess of insulin also he needs hypoglycemic capsules. So how do you detect hypoglycemia? So you can call it most commonly known as Whipple's triad. There will be symptoms of hypoglycemia which are because of the sympathetic and adrenergic overactivity like tachycardia, palpitations, sweating, all kinds of symptoms you will come across. These are nothing but they are what you say protective mechanisms that are telling your body to consume something. The first thing what happens when the sugar levels fall down below 70 is, first thing is the insulin should not rise. The insulin should come down. The next thing is your glucagon should come up, because you need your glucagon to synthesize the basal insulin, that is the endogenous insulin, which is synthesized in the liver, like by hepatic gluconeogenesis. And the next thing is your epinephrine. These are all insulin counter-regulatory hormones. They are antagonists to insulin action. So your epinephrine comes up. The epinephrine can be synthesized from your adrenal medulla or from the sympathetic system as well. And even growth hormone and cortisol levels also rise as a precautionary measure. And in some individuals, the level at which these symptoms you usually see it as 70 milligram per deciliter. But this threshold can be either high or low for some patients. For chronic diabetes, the threshold may be even higher. Even at 80 or 85 also, they can experience symptoms of hypoglycemia. For somebody whom we have controlled aggressively, whom we have controlled the diabetes aggressively, for them, the threshold may even come down. So that is at 55 or 65 also, they may not experience symptoms of hypoglycemia. So as we know, the most common causes iatrogenic or drug-induced inappropriate dosing or excessive dosing. The other common causes are any stress induced, like the patient is having any sepsis or any heart failure, liver failure, all kind of sepsis-induced conditions, and the insulinoma, where there is endogenous production of insulin, other functional beta islet cell tumors, and various other causes. So what you do immediately when you recognize, there will be sweating. These sweating and all are because of release of acetylcholine. And the patient, when immediately you check his sugar levels, first thing you have to do whenever you experience the patient in our ANC or ICU or in a casualty when he's sweating and all, go and check his RBS. Sometimes if you miss it, it can lead to seizures, it can lead to coma, it can lead to altered sensory and all. And simply if you connect him, if he's orally is able to take, you can give him a sugar low, or you can simply connect a dextrose drip, and you can immediately see the reversal of the patient. The patient is completely alright, and you can further proceed your evaluation. Even renal failure patients also, they are at risk for hypoglycemia because of the impaired excretion of some kind insulin secretagogues and insulin. And you can frequently encounter it in your daily postings. So be aware of it and properly check for insulin doses, properly monitor these renal parameters, and if you at all you find look for these adrenergic symptoms like tachycardia and sweating and palpitations and all. And if you feel that it is not iatrogenic or drug related, you can further evaluate the patient for the causes of hypoglycemia.
Doctor? Huh? Dr. Ravina is going to summarize what Dr. Deepak has told us, the relevant ones. Yes.
Hypoglycemia is a common condition to come across. It is mainly due to iatrogenic or drug-induced. Patients present with sweating, tachycardia and palpitations.
So the clinical features, yes, and the etiologies you mentioned only iatrogenic.
Drug-induced.
Yeah, that's also iatrogenic. So what else can cause hypoglycemia?
Beta cell hypertension.
Yeah, if the beta cells are hyper-functioning, yes. Yeah, because of some beta cell tumor. Anything else? Yeah, so again drug-induced. The commonest drug, that's a new MCQ. The commonest drug to cause hypoglycemia is alcohol. Okay, so anything else?
Over-exercising. Gastric surgeries like lower bowel gastric
Yes,
bypass. Weight loss.
elementary hypoglycemia because of fast emptying. Huh?
Occult diabetes mellitus can also manifest as initial hypoglycemia.
Diabetes mellitus,
Occult diabetes.
occult diabetes. How? Because of increased beta cell activity. Anything else?
Critical illness, sepsis.
Okay, sepsis causing hypoglycemia is very, very, yes, very, very interesting. There's a lot of detail there. Maybe for your short note, maybe only sepsis hypoglycemia, not a broad topic like hypoglycemia. Now, if somebody gets hypoglycemia, he'll write a lot of things and you will just get your marks. But sepsis hypoglycemia could be a specific question. So there you have to mention the pathways. How sepsis is causing the hypoglycemia. So whether it's going through the adrenal cortex. So adrenal hypocortisolism can cause hypoglycemia. Addison's disease. And what else will it cause? Hyperkalemia, hyponatremia, because of the low mineralocorticoid activity, and because of low glucocorticoid activity, that might lead to hypoglycemia and hypertension and all those other things. Now, so we learned about the clinical features, we learned about the etiopathogenesis, and we learned how to manage it by giving it, and that's it. That's all about hypoglycemia in your mental model. Does anybody want to add anything more to this conceptual model of hypoglycemia, which we can initiate? Okay, so we move to the next speaker.
It is one of the
So, Preeti, how do you learn to throw your voice? It is not in your exam, but I think it's important. Especially because you did not bother to arrange it.
Atrial fibrillation is one of the most common. Especially in the elderly people, and the atrial fibrillation, it is the rapid and disorganized activation of the atria with loss of atrial contraction. Here the atrial activation will be there, but there will be loss of atrial contraction, which results in the decreased cardiac output and hence the symptoms. And risk factors for atrial fibrillation include underlying cardiac disease, obesity, sleep apnea, hypertension, and diabetes mellitus. So coronary artery disease can contribute to atrial fibrillation, and atrial fibrillation can also contribute to heart failure. And types of atrial fibrillation include paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, that is sudden onset atrial fibrillation, and it resolves spontaneously within 7 days of the onset. And long-standing or persistent atrial fibrillation is which sustains for more than 7 days. Once the patient comes to us, he can be asymptomatic, or he may present with symptoms such as palpitations, syncope, etc. And one of the main risk factor in not treating the atrial fibrillation is the patient can land up in tachycardia-induced cardiomyopathy because of the repeated tachycardia, the heart being beating. The patient will land up in cardiomyopathy and hence heart failure also. And atrial fibrillation pathophysiology is like there is an ectopic foci near the pulmonary vein, near the pulmonary veins, left atrium. And there is even other ectopic foci or the other ectopic foci also include the non-pulmonary vein areas. And fibrosis after myocardial infarction, if the patient has fibrosis, that can also act as an ectopic foci, and hence the patient can land up in atrial fibrillation. And
So how does the atrial ectopic foci around the left atrial vein interface? induce an atrial fibrillation. I mean, it will induce an atrial ectopy, and we know that atrial ectopy is different in the ECG from atrial fibrillation. So how does the ectopy lead to atrial fibrillation?
It can be the ectopic foci can lead to the activation of the atria as well. This is conducted when compared to the normal sign. Normal
Activation of the synovial node, which is the pacemaker, and that thing is conducted to the AV node, and then it goes into the bundle of phase, and we have a normal QR.
If the activation is through AV node, like after SL node, AV node and then the ventricles, then there is an AV nodal conduction delay, sir, which is physiological. But when the foci is ectopic, that will not be.
With an atrial ectopy, you will have the same kind of
And re-entrant mechanism.
that may be giving you a different kind of atrial arrhythmia, let's say, but not atrial fibrillation. So how is atrial fibrillation mechanism different from, let us say, PSVT, which is also including atrial fibrillation, but there are non-atrial fibrillation PSVTs also. So basically SVT we can call it, supraventricular tachycardia, and supraventricular tachycardia you can have atrial fibrillation, you can have non-atrial fibrillation supraventricular tachycardia. So how is atrial fibrillation differently generated? One which we are talking about re-entry phenomenon and other triggered activities and other things are basically supraventricular tachycardia without atrial fibrillation. How is atrial fibrillation different from this? So you have only one atrial ectopic foci in atrium during atrial fibrillation, or how many atrial foci do you have?
Multiple.
Yeah, how many multiple foci? How many atrial ectopics are generated to produce atrial fibrillation? 300 to 400 atrial ectopic foci. Adrenal atrium and atrium. It is like a style. There will be multiple foci. And 300 to 400 will compete with each other to reach the AV node and through the AV node. But in that there will be a physiological block, because you can't allow 300 400 people to cross your gate number 2 altogether. The gate is regulating, it's a bottleneck. So slowly their entry will be reduced. So although there are 300 to 400 atrial ectopic foci, only 120 150 at the most are allowed to get in at one time, and that's why you have tachycardia 140 150. You don't have a tachycardia 400. So there it is being regulated by the AV node, which is causing a physiological delay. Now, after that goes in, what happens? It is like any other atrial ectopy. The P wave will be deformed because it's not coming from the SA node. So the P wave will hardly be visible because it's coming from so many places around the atrium, not the SA node. So it will hardly be visible, and it will generate a series of QRS, which will be obviously more than 100, and so that is what. But then because each and every ectopic is coming not at a timed rhythmic manner, that's why you have an irregular rhythm. So that is what ECG will show you, the absence of P wave and irregular RR intervals. So after the equilibrium discussion, you were supposed to move to how to clinically diagnose. So what will be the clinical differentiation? Let's say a person comes with palpitation. How will you clinically differentiate whether this palpitation is because of atrial fibrillation or is it because of a volume overload state? What will be the nature of the palpitation? Such a situation.
Palpitation is irregular, sir. And we need to know the difference between the pulse rate and the heart rate.
That is a clinical evaluation objective. But what I'm saying is, what is the question complaint? How will you distinguish clinical complaint as probably atrial fibrillation versus volume overload state? What will the patient complain?
Volume overload, we'll be able to see the change.
This is a symptom. Those are signs which are coming. So generally, examination is paroxysm. Whenever the patient complains, they complain of paroxysmal palpitations. That tells you that it's an arrhythmia. It could be attributed, it could be anything. It could be PSVT also, it could be BP also. So that is paroxysm. Whereas if it's a volume overload state, it will be associated with regular pounding kind of palpitation. Pounding palpitation. Whereas this will be intermittent paroxysmal palpitation. This is just a very subjective description. Now, yes, as you said, objectively, you did point out some clinical features. So there will be an effects pulse deficit, and then finally the most important objective feature would be ECG, and we already described ECG. So what more do you need to make a diagnosis in atrial fibrillation? So your diagnosis, the patient has atrial fibrillation. Now you want to diagnose why he has atrial fibrillation. So how would you diagnose that? So the person comes to you with atrial fibrillation. What is the next step in your work?
We do echocardiography, sir. On echocardiography, there will be a possibility that we can
Why
find
not X-ray first before echocardiogram? Are we avoiding X-rays because they cause radiation and echocardiography doesn't cause, so we straight away jump to echocardiography? What is the advantage of a X-ray over echocardiography? Why do we still do it? I still get it done. Well, one of the biggest advantages is you can see the lungs. If the patient also has pulmonary edema, you can pick it up. You may not be able to pick it up on echo, although some people can, but it would be difficult. But X-ray will show it to you. What else? You will be able to see the size of the heart, or in total. In echo also you can measure the size, but that may be difficult and subjective. Whereas in X-ray, everybody can tell, okay, this is an enlarged heart, this is not an enlarged heart. It's very easy to identify. So I think these are the few points where the X-ray still scores over the. So I would suggest, this is of course a debatable thing. I would think X-rays have to be done even now, a chest X-ray simple, and a 2D echo case. So why do we get 2D echo?
There is a possibility that because of the irregular contraction of the heart, there will be a left atrial thrombus formation, sir. If this and
Those are complications. But what about etiology? So, do you think that there is some etiology to it, or can it be a lone atrial fibrillation where there is nothing to be found in the heart? That's all. So,
hepatic mitral stenosis or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So
yes, any kind of cardiac disease which causes a LA pressure overload or volume overload, and it causes the stretching of the LA, that's what we assume can cause multiple atrial ectopic foci and give rise to atrial fibrillation. So, coronary artery disease is the commonest, notorious thing to happen. Hypertensive heart disease, comorbidities generally, and of course cardiomyopathies. And pneumatic heart disease is a very important contender. Was till 10 years back, even now, to a large extent, for atrial fibrillation. And yes, even endocrinopathies like hyperthyroidism. That's also very important. So all these things can cause atrial fibrillation, and we look for it. So other than your echocardiography, if you do not find anything, you will still ask for a thyroid profile perhaps. What are other things in your work of atrial fibrillation you use? Electrolytes. Why? Is it fitting into etiopathogenesis, or is it something else which can precipitate atrial fibrillation? Yeah, what? What electrolyte abnormality will precipitate it? That's why I think like atrial fibrillation, like ATP, whatever. So, hypochemical, but not hyperchemical. Hyperchemical is so there are some MCQs in this atrial fibrillation. There are some common questions in this atrial fibrillation. Do anybody know this? Let's say, what is the commonest drug used for atrial fibrillation? Not an MCQ, but we are coming to that. Yes. So basically, we want to increase the physiological refractory period of the AV node so that the rate is reduced. Because ultimately, the rate is harming the patient. If you have 150 rate, how does the patient get harmed? Let us say he's got mitral stenosis or a LV failure, coronary artery disease, infarction in the past. How does the patient get harmed when increased rate, and what is the benefit in reducing it? So this is all logic. I'm not sure whether we have any empirical evidence to this, but it is logic. So the oxygen demand of the heart will increase due to the workload will increase, and the heart will fill for it. One. And what about mitral stenosis? In a patient of mitral stenosis, there is no left ventricular failure. If at all there is a left atrial failure because of left atrial outflow obstruction. So how does a left atrial failure affect the patient with high fast ventricular rate in atrial fibrillation? You can pass it left and right. Give others an opportunity. You want to pass it left or right? I think left is better because right have already made their presence felt. Yeah, would you like to take that question? For us, try to also tell us that question. Yeah, give it to the interns to hold it. Yeah, maybe you can come here and that's a nice job, photography, video photography. Now you must use the pause button. You don't want to show everything. Yes. Suddenly, then what will happen? Then you have pulmonary edema. But if it rises slowly, that will go through the capillaries and that will cause pulmonary arterial hemorrhage. So when you have sudden rise of pulmonary venous pressure, you will have pulmonary edema. So that is one important thing which you want to prevent, and that's why you want to use rate control. Now what else do we use? So what can we use for rate control other than beta blockers, calcium channel blockers and other blockers? What else? Very, very old drug, digoxin. So the digoxin is a bit minefield for MCQs. So one MCQ is, what are the following are the arrhythmias seen with digoxin except. So there is only one arrhythmia which doesn't happen with digoxin. All the other arrhythmias in the book have been described with digoxin. Which is that arrhythmia? What? I can't hear you.
Second degree AV block.
Yeah, but isn't there a particular type of secondary AV block? I think it's Mobius type 2, isn't it? So Mobius type 2 is the answer in the MCQ. So everything except Mobius type 2. Probably, from what I can remember from years of thing, I may be wrong. So that is the part. Now we have pharmacological therapy for atrial fibrillation, which we have roughly approximately delineated. We have not talked about all the drugs that are being used. And we have non-pharmacological therapies. So what are the non-pharmacological therapies that can be tried?
So cardiac ablation.
I hope some sounds are coming into the mic here. Probably we don't have a mic here.
First rate control is done, then anticoagulation is taken into consideration.
Okay, that is pharmacological anticoagulation because why?
Anticoagulation because if there is any underlying heart disease, there can be a risk of dislodgement of the thrombus if it all is formed.
So if there is underlying thrombus, then there is a risk of dislodgement. So how do we prove that there is underlying thrombus? What workup?
Echocardiography.
Transducer
But in the
value.
echocardiogram, you may not be able to see it. Transthoracic, chance of picking up the thrombus.
Transducer value.
Transesophageal. So how does the sensitivity improve with transesophageal? If transthoracic is 10 to 50%, how much does it become transesophageal? Maybe 70% at best. Still you have chances of missing it. So that's the reason you might just like to anticoagulate everybody. Anticoagulate everybody who has atrial fibrillation. Probably they may have some microthrombi, and that way you might prevent. But yes, we need some evidence that blanket anticoagulation in atrial fibrillation is useful. Or else, it would be better to have a risk score. And we are all aware of a risk score for atrial fibrillation, whether they require anticoagulation or not. And what is that? CHADS. CHADS. What is CHAD?
C is congestive
Nowadays you
heart.
have heard of the CHADOX trial. That's a trial in Oxford for the vaccine they are preparing. This is CHAD score. So C is for
Congestive heart failure. It's
and this is
given
what we have.
1 point. H is hypertension. 1 point.
Hypertension.
A is age more than 75 years, 2 points.
Age, yes.
2 points. And diabetes mellitus.
Diabetes mellitus, yes.
Any vascular event.
Yes. So if you have got these multiple comorbidities which are predisposing you to develop endothelial dysfunction and probably endotheliosis and thrombogenicity. Again, based on empirical evidence, you might benefit better with anticoagulation. But I am not sure about the evidence really. We need to discuss that. That will be a journal work, which I am hoping to introduce into your exams as well, where you can find out now, the next step will be to find out that particular RCT where they have given anticoagulation according to Shadoff scoring, and where they have not given anticoagulation even if the Shadoff scoring is suggested. So, and then they have matched the outcomes. What happened to those who did not receive it? What happened to those who received it? If there was a trial like this done. So we have to look at it. Okay, so this is the management part of it, the pharmacological management, that to the non-atrial fibrillation management, indirect atrial fibrillation, collateral damage management. Now, what else other than thrombos, anticoagulants and AV nodal blocking agents? What other than these two pharmacological agents do we have? And if not, then what are the non-pharmacological agents?
Even class 1 antiarrhythmics and class 3 antiarrhythmics.
Yes, you have told us AV nodal blocking agents in terms of calcium channel beta blockers, which are also particular class, I think class 3, class 4. And then what about class 1, C and class 2? Yeah, how do they help? Are they for rate control or are they for rhythm? Rhythm. So how do we control the rhythm and the efficacy of these drugs? I think the drugs are not very efficacious in control of the rhythm. But again, we need a general to find out how much they are really efficacious if at all. And what is the next thing we do for rhythm control?
And if the patient is hemodynamically unstable, then we can do the cardioversion.
Only if the patient is hemodynamically unstable because of the good thing, we'll go for DC cardioversion. But what if the patient is not hemodynamically unstable? So which are those atrial fibrillation we can straight away go for rhythm control by using DC cardioversion? One is of course hemodynamically unstable. Second, any acute atrial fibrillation we can do. Why? Why can't we do it in chronic atrial fibrillations? Because the likelihood of thrombus is more. So if we do, when the thrombus migrates, it's when the person becomes from atrial fibrillation to no atrial fibrillation. So when the person is recovering from atrial fibrillation, also the thrombus can dislodge. So that is why we will not make the person recover, so that the thrombus may not be dislodged. So in chronic we can't do that. We have to first anticoagulate the patient, make the thrombus probably less thrombogenic, and then after 3 weeks or 4 weeks of anticoagulation we can do a DC cardioversion. Whereas in acute atrial fibrillation we can straight away do a DC cardioversion. So that is one thing, the non-pharmacological management of atrial fibrillation. What else in the non-pharmacological management? So if we can know where from the atrial foci are generated, of course we know that it's coming from any part of the atrium. So what exactly does RF ablation mean here? What is the mechanism of therapy here for atrial fibrillation? So what you are doing is you are just putting some, like a welder, you go there and put some, you burn those areas with RF ablation. RF ablation is just a burning machine. It just burns those tissues and you have big spots there. So how is that burning of the circuits there useful to atrial fibrillation? I mean, how does it basically take away the atrial fibrillation?
Fibrous tissue
Fibrous tissue forms. So if fibrous tissue forms, the circuits are broken, is it?
muscle continuity gets
So if the circuits are broken and the atrial foci are generating, they will not be able to conduct to the AV node. That is the idea, hypothesis behind using it. Okay. Are you happy with it? You are not happy. So would you like to tell us something as to how RF ablation really helps you?